If you're talking about it, we're talking about it. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're into the second hour of this live broadcast. Really powerful segment from on the ground in Yemen from award-winning journalist Yusuf Mauri after the U.S. and U.K. bombed multiple cities in his country, killing dozens. Not quite what the official statement claims, that they're only hitting military facilities. Well, we saw a lot of civilians in that footage as well. So, I mean, at this point, folks, it's beyond a joke. But then again, what we've witnessed over the last 8 months now, going on 8 months, believe it or not, that itself is incredible in Gaza. What we've witnessed over the last 8 months means nothing should shock us or surprise us. That in itself is a sad thing indeed. But over to the political side of things and the policy side of things and what's really happening right now, I want to bring on to the program independent journalist. He's also independent correspondent at the U.S. State Department in Washington, D.C., Sam Husseini, joining us on the line right now. Sam, thank you for coming on board this Friday. I know things have been hectic, to say the least. There's a lot going on this week in politics. There's a lot going on that we see, and there's a whole lot more going on that we're not seeing. Regarding the Middle East, Biden's apparently floated a type of a temporary ceasefire deal. First of all, is there anything in this that's noteworthy, or are we merely kicking the can down the road? There's other things going on. Just tell us what you're looking at right now, Sam.
I think it's a matter of kicking the can down the road, and very strategically from the Biden administration perspective. What they're facing right now is the nakedness of their so-called red line regarding Rafah. They said that they didn't want Israel to go into Rafah, and if it did, then they'd really be mad. Israel was now obviously in Rafah. The International Court of Justice itself said that they were in Rafah, or that they commenced their attack as of May 7th. So it's been the better part of a month. And so they're facing a UN resolution on that. That's in the works at the UN. We can talk about that if you like. And they're also facing these resignations. And as I say, the nakedness of their alleged, red line to Israel. So I think there's a desperate impulse among the Biden administration to change the subject. And I believe we've seen this pattern before in the past when they faced a UN Security Council resolution. And they want to water it down, they want to change the subject, they shift to this discussion of so-called negotiations, where they're the ones calling the shots, because they're in the midst of the alleged negotiations between Qatar and Egypt and Israel and so on, and then they can manage what expectations or alleged nuance or machinations is going on there, so that they can pretend that one set of negotiations worked and one set of negotiations doesn't. It's a highly opaque system. It's what they want. They don't want a law-based system. They want a rules-based system where they get to change the rules day to day. That's what they want.
Here's what you put up on X recently. You're saying that I figure that Biden wants to appear non-genocidal at times, so enough people will delude themselves into voting for him. He also wants to stress, quote, negotiations to prevent the implementation of international law, especially uniting for peace. Now, I've seen you've also put something out just reminding people about the UN General Assembly's Uniting for Peace resolution. Why is this important, and can this come into play right now, Sam Husseini?
Absolutely, it can come into play, and it should come into play if all of these countries claiming to be opposed to Israel's actions, from Brazil to Algeria to Turkey, and so on, if they were to put their shoulder to the wheel and try to look, the ICJ said we're putting forward orders. Israel, in their latest order, has to stop its offensive in Rafah. That then it becomes up to the UN Security Council to implement that order. I've heard people, including quote unquote progressive people, say that there's no enforcement mechanism for ICJ orders. There is an enforcement mechanism. to the UN Security Council. It just isn't happening because the US veto is preventing it from fulfilling its function as described in the UN Charter. But there is an override to that in the face of an unjust US veto, and that's the Uniting for Peace maneuver that can be done by the General Assembly to effectively take control of the situation from the Security Council. I did a fair amount of research. I know I've raised this with you before, but I did a fair amount of research and I put out a piece today on this, Patrick. The most successful time that Uniting for Peace was done actually also involved Gaza. It was in 1956 when Israel conspired with France and England to invade Egypt after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. They moved in, and then you had the US and the Soviet Union join together with virtually every other country on the planet to use Uniting for Peace to demand a withdrawal of all of those forces. And fairly quickly, the British forces withdrew, and the French forces withdrew. The British government fell in total humiliation. Israel actually tried for many months to hold on to Gaza in that entire process. We're talking 1956, 1957, but finally in 1957, the Eisenhower administration prevailed upon Israel to finally leave Gaza. So this has been done successfully when there was when there was enough overlap and enough power centers to apply international law in spite of a veto. Now, U.S. has a lot more power now still than France and England had then. They were vetoing everything at the Security Council at the time, were threatening to do so. So the Security Council couldn't do its job. Now, Security Council can do its job because of the U.S. veto. It's up to people to prevail upon countries to implement Uniting for Peace. And you could do a number of things there. You could have sanctions on Israel, sever diplomatic relations, suspend Israel from membership from General Assembly, admit Palestine as a full-fledged voting member, as well as set up a tribunal. You could even set up a protection force, which is effectively what the Houthis, the so-called Houthis, are doing in Yemen. I mean, that they say that we're implementing the will of the world. You all say you want to ceasefire. Nobody's doing anything to do that. We're going to do something to do that. So that there are a number of things that can and should be done to get beyond the UN speeches and to maximize what can be done under international law.
Well, definitely, it seems like a straightforward one, Sam, would be sanctions. Any country could act unilaterally or in concert with their allies. I think a United for Peace resolution on sanctions at the General Assembly level would be a type of a signal that it's okay to enact sanctions against Israel, and the international community is behind it. And the United States will probably want to threaten countries doing that with various diplomatic threats, maybe economic threats. But if enough countries do it, Sam, then that becomes a really bad look for the U.S. and Israel. And I think this would have a direct effect on what's happening right now in Gaza. I really think that sanctions, if they're undertaken by enough countries, are going to have a huge impact. They have before in history in some situations. Why can't this happen? Why isn't Russia leading the way? Is not China leading the way, or European countries, Spain? They seem to be very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. Why is this not happening, Sam?
Yeah, I think that there's a threshold that hasn't been met yet in terms of countries really putting their shoulder to the wheel. The only two countries that are, fairly well put their shoulder to the wheel are South Africa by invoking the Genocide Convention, and then Nicaragua being the first country to back up South Africa in that endeavor, and then to file suit against Germany for its support of Israel's genocide. Other than that, there's been a lot of rhetoric, and some of it very good, and some of it very commendable from a lot of the countries that you mentioned. But not actual action. Now, to what extent they are afraid or intimidated or don't want to polarize significantly with the United States or with Israel, for that matter, is another question. So I think it's partly a lobbying effort on the part of activists around the world to not just simply be satisfied when when a country does a denunciation of Israel or gives a good speech. No, that's not enough. They have to implement a set of processes and a set of policies to not just be okay with sanctions against Israel, but to recommend them. That you have to have 2/3 majority in the General Assembly to say we recommend countries do sanctions against Israel because of this, that, and the other violation of international law. That's what could happen here, and then that would dramatically escalate pressure on Israel and the United States. And it sort of is like a solidarity thing. It's like you got to be like a union organizer, I guess, and all of these countries to stick together and not the U.S. try to pay off or bribe or threaten various countries into inaction or paralysis or delaying things, which I think is, again, part of what we saw today from Biden. This is a delay tactic. They full well know that Algeria has put forward a resolution at the UN Security Council, and they full well know that they're going to want to veto it if they can't water it down sufficiently. So they want to delay, obscure the process. Thank God that Trump's verdict came down so that the attention of the American public is diverted into that. They bombed Yemen. I've been trying to get an exact timeline, but I believe a half hour or so after the Trump verdict came down. So that becomes a question of this kind of a variation on wag the dog. That they knew that everybody was focusing on the Trump verdict. So that's a nice way to get some cheap licks into Yemen without the U.S. public processing it, which itself is fascinating because people don't remember it. But, the whole Stormy Daniels thing, when that broke in 2018 and she got on 60 Minutes, that's when Trump bombed Syria to divert attention. This was mainstream thinking back then, but it's been totally forgotten. A lot of people in the mainstream was like, hold on, did Trump just pull a wag the dog? He just bombed Syria when the Stormy Daniels thing broke, very similar to the movie Wag the Dog and when Bill Clinton bombed the Sudan and then Iraq at different stages of the Lewinsky scandal.
Yeah, just a more lurid episode of Wag the Dog, obviously hiding behind Stormy Daniels' assets more than once. Not good. Remind everybody, Sam, Bill Clinton bombed a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan, claimed that bin Laden was hiding there. I guess that was the plot, and that was at the height of the Monica Lewinsky thing. He also bombed Iraq around the same time. So yeah, the White House gets very busy on the bombing front when things are happening domestically.
Right. The bombing of the Sudan happened the day that Lewinsky was testifying, and the bombing of Iraq happened just before his scheduled impeachment. So they correlate perfectly.
Well, in this case, it's a deadly political maneuver. If it is indeed partly politically motivated, people have died in Yemen. We just spoke to award-winning journalist Yusuf Mowry in the previous segment. Very sad that this is the case, but actually it has huge implications geopolitically, because basically this is hardening support for Palestine. It's hardening the resolve of the axis of resistance countries. So it's going to end up having a boomerang effect, Sam, despite what I guess, I don't know, is that what the U.S. and the U.K. want? They want to escalate somehow. I think they're a little bit naive in thinking that this show of force is somehow going to abate this realignment in the Middle East, but it hasn't done so yet. In fact, things continue to realign as a result. So I'm going to ask you, Sam, just based on how you're seeing the situation, where is Egypt in all of this after the incident that happened? One of their soldiers or killed and taking casualties at the hands of the IDF at Rafah at the border crossing. Is there any potential for Egypt changing its position on this situation? It's been quite a long time now. Haven't heard much from Egypt. They kind of want to stay out of it. Is that a game changer? Any other breaks in the usual facades that you see coming?
Yeah, I'm not sure. No, I don't think that Egypt, short of a real break, a Nasser, a bunch of colonels taking over or something like that. Sisi seems quite intent on, occasional rhetorical flourishes. I think Egypt said that they were going to join the South African suit a week or two ago, but they haven't done so. There's a list of countries that say that they will do it and then never do. Mexico actually did just do it. So I think that, virtually all of the Arab states are in one form or another, captured or so weakened that they can't assert themselves meaningfully. And that's part of a long-term U.S. process that was decades in the making to ensure that the Arab states were in that state. So I don't see any major ruptures on the horizon, any major departures in terms of policy from any of these states, other than the possibility of internal disturbance of some sort.
So we got Joe Biden press conference here. You've probably seen this clip already, Sam. I want to get your reaction to what the president of the United States is saying here regarding the situation in Gaza and U.S. policy with Israel. Let's go ahead and roll this, and we'll get your take on this on the other side. Go ahead with.
This new proposal has three phases. The first phase would last for 6 weeks. Here's what it would include: a full and complete ceasefire, a withdrawal of Israeli forces from all populated areas of Gaza, release of a number of hostages, including women, the elderly, the wounded, in exchange for release of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. There are American hostages who would be released at this stage, and we want them home. Additional, some remains of hostages who have been killed would be returned to their families, bringing some degree of closure to that terrible grief. Palestinians, civilians would return to their homes and neighborhoods in all areas of Gaza, including in the north. Humanitarian assistance would surge, with 600 trucks carrying aid into Gaza every single day. With the ceasefire, that aid could be safely and effectively distributed to all who need it. Hundreds of thousands of temporary shelters, including housing units, would be delivered by the international community. All that and more would begin immediately.
What's going on here, Sam? What's forcing his hand? Is it the fact that the floating pier floated away? Palestinians can return to their homes in the north of Gaza. What homes? They've all been pulverized. So it's another temporary ceasefire grand plan. We've been here before, Sam. How is this going to be different than the last one? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's my suspicion that this isn't going to be different than the last one. It's my suspicion that this is simply a short-term maneuver to get him out of the jam about not having a red line for Rafah, even though the invasion is underway in Rafah. The bad look from the statements from the Israelis recently that this is going to go on till the end of the year. Electorally, I think Biden would want there to be some kind of pause, maybe not immediately, maybe this is a stepping stone to a future pause to put this issue on the back burner during the election. He wants the issue to be Trump and his, alleged criminality and shenanigans and whatever, so that he can be screaming "Orange Man, Orange Man, Orange Man." He doesn't want to be screamed at "Genocider, Genocider, Genocider." I mean, it would be interesting to see if there is a response from Hamas to this, because they have been serious, apparently, about, accepting some kind of ceasefire resolution. they want it to be permanent. They don't want a 6-week pause and then Israel goes back to square one and resumes bombing the crap out of people. That's not a solution. So there's a lot of maneuver here, given the opaque situation for Biden and company to posture one way, but the actual substance of the alleged proposal to be something altogether different.
The thing that I don't understand about this, I'm miffed, Sam. 6 weeks, and he's talking about a surge in international humanitarian assistance. So obviously, international aid workers coming in, UN workers, UN supplies, people going back to the north. Why just 6 weeks? What's going to happen after 6 weeks? A resuming of the bombing runs?
Right.
I don't understand why it's not a permanent proposal for a ceasefire. That's the part that to me it just doesn't add up, Sam.
Right. And I mean, it could be, one dimension to this could be, if this is a quote unquote serious offer, is that, Netanyahu's under pressure from the families to try to get them out, the ones that are still alive. And I'm always reminded of the situation with Iraq. If you remember, Iraq, when it moved into Kuwait, had captured a lot of Westerners. And then people like Jesse Jackson and European parliamentarians all went to Iraq and convinced Saddam Hussein to, release all of the captives that Iraq had. And he released them all by December of 1990. And within a month is when the bombing started. Now, of course, Gaza is already getting bombed, but it's quite possible that they just want to do a 6-week pause to get all the captives. And once that mission is accomplished, and, it would further empower Netanyahu if he got all of the captives out. And then he can say, okay, now that prevention, that road bump isn't there, and I can resume bombing Gaza. And, if they're going to release a bunch of Palestinian captives, I'm unclear as to what the heck is preventing Israel from them rounding up all the Palestinians who they release in any deal, right? I mean, the Palestinians can't get back the Israeli captives, but the Israelis can get back the Palestinian captives, or at least certainly most of them. So this is, just an incredibly asymmetric situation. And I think that, again, Biden wants to get out of the jam from his perspective he's in, because you got an ICJ order that is, clearer and sharper than most of the others to say Israel must stop its offensive. Now, the Security Council has to implement that. U.S. is trying to stop UN Security Council from implementing that. It's a nightmare for the U.S. if this goes to the General Assembly and you get 2/3 of the countries saying, you got to implement that, and we're going to put teeth into it this time. The General Assembly met under Uniting for Peace last year, and they passed by 153 countries to, I think, 10, saying there's got to be a ceasefire. But they didn't put any teeth into it. They didn't put any sanctions. They didn't put any tribunals. They didn't put any severing diplomatic relations. Nothing. They just said, we'll be appraised of the situation. So the General Assembly can't at any point call a Uniting for Peace meeting. I think you need a majority of the General Assembly to call for the meeting, but presumably that's doable. So Biden is trying to head that day off by saying, no, don't call a meeting. No, we're working on it. We're working on it. Stay tuned. We got negotiations going for a ceasefire. Honest. That could well be what Biden and company are doing.
Right. So he's saying any efforts by anyone in the international community to go disrupt these very, very delicate and fragile efforts that we're working very closely with the Israelis to organize this temporary ceasefire. Sam, I totally see that as a very likely scenario here. Why? Because we've seen it all before. These games are not unfamiliar to. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, you're reading it absolutely right. And I think that the domestic analogy is to give some credence to people who don't want Trump, who are just obsessed with not wanting Trump, but are repelled by what Biden is doing, to say, okay, Biden's trying to do the right thing here. I'm going to be able to live with myself if I, plan on voting for this guy. Whereas, if it looked like, oh my God, am I really put myself in this position where I'm voting for a genocidal maniac? I can't do that. So he wants to muddy the waters sufficiently so that enough of the U.S. public goes along with this, or that there's no critical mass of the U.S. public that just stands up and says no, and potentially no to both of you. That's my vote pact strategy, or people from the left and right rebel against the establishment. That also would be another nightmare from Biden's point of view. So he's muddying the waters both internationally and domestically. He doesn't want the UN and the international community to assert itself, and he doesn't want the U.S. public to assert itself.
And that also neutralizes the RFK challenge to Biden, because normally there's no difference between them on Israeli policy between Trump, RFK, and Biden. But by doing this temporary, it sort of pulls the wool over people's eyes enough, where Biden might be losing on a bunch of other policies to RFK, popular policies, but on the Gaza issue, Democrats are just hemorrhaging support, and that support won't necessarily go elsewhere. But if it does, it means that they'll bite their tongue and vote for RFK, maybe. But a lot of it's just going out into the ether. And I know people, Sam, and you probably have spoken to people as well, even in Washington, D.C., that's saying they are not going to vote for anybody in the presidential election. They'll do the down ballot races, but they're so disgusted with everybody at the top of the ballot that they're not going to lodge a protest vote. Some with Jill Stein, perhaps, but on this issue of Gaza, it is a big issue, and it's a lot bigger than people had calculated, I think, when this all kicked off 8 months ago. Your final thoughts, Sammy? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's an emblematic issue in a number of ways. It's sort of a cornerstone of U.S. policy. It has to do with free speech issues and civil liberties, and is tied into a whole cluster of things. I do think RFK, I wrote a fair amount about him last year, and I think that he's fundamentally a tool of the establishment in order to muddy the waters again. He misfunneled all of the grievances around the pandemic into backing of Israel in large part. If you look around the people around him, his daughter-in-law is managing his campaign. She's former CIA. So I think it is the nightmare. Lindsey Graham said it years ago. Their nightmare is the left and right getting together. Their nightmare is that. And I wouldn't put it past the system to have devised or acquiesced to the RFK Jr. campaign in order to further muddy the waters. We should be at a place where the Green Party and the Libertarian Party had, come together, as they did, if you recall, at the Rage Against the War Machine rallies of a year and a half ago. That should have been built on more than it has. And so the system has, again, delayed a day of reckoning that should be well upon us by this point.
Sam Husseini, independent journalist, also an independent State Department correspondent. Check out Sam's work on Substack, husseini.substack.com, and also on X, Twitter as well. Really appreciate you joining us this week, Sam, on TNT.
Thank you, Patrick. Always a pleasure.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. Excellent take and analysis, overview of the situation from Sam Husseini. Let's take a break, however, with the network. When we come back, final thoughts today and for the week here on today's News Talk. I'm Patrick Henningsen. We'll be right back.